but of course the speaker will be presented right away to you. This webinar is a webinar where you will be muted, so you can submit your questions in the question panel if that should be necessary. So please do so during the presentation so that we can, at the end of the presentation, provide you with an answer to your question. Should your question not be replied, these will be uploaded on the CEN-CENELEC website together with the answers so that you can consult them whenever you want to. We also are on Twitter, so please use the hashtag 1010webinar in order to tweet about this webinar. So let me introduce you the speaker of today. Her name is Andrea Nam, and she's Project Manager for Energy and Living in the Standardization and Digital Solutions department here at the CEN-CENELEC Management Center. So Andrea, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for your interest in the environmental issues and aspects in standardization. So to start with, I would like to speak a bit about the EU policy framework, considering that CEN-CENELEC are EU organizations, therefore the Basic Act, the treaty, the EU treaty applies to us. You can see in the very first sentence I added that in the Article 191 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the EU environmental policy aims to preserve, protect, and improve the quality of the environment and to protect the human health, it's stating. Nevertheless, the EU 2020 policy objectives for the environment are framed in the 7th EU Environmental Action Programme to 2020. This aims to transform the EU into an inclusive and sustainable green economy. And we should bear in mind that environmental problems don't stop at the borders. The CEN 2020 strategy is in line with the 7th EU Environmental Action Programme. But the standardization work is framed by the Regulation 1025 of 2012 on European standardization, which indicates very clearly that standards should take into account environmental impacts throughout the life cycle of products and services. However, we have to know that the environmental aspects in standards represent some challenges. The main objective of this is to set criteria, methods to be used with the purpose of protecting the environment. But as the standards themselves, also the environmental aspects are voluntary. And there are various perceptions you need to face. Is it relevant at all? How to address environmental aspects in a sufficient way? And other questions. And of course, we all know that is one out of many requirements standard drafters need to face and look at: safety, performance, quality, interoperability, and so on. And environmental aspects in standards need careful planning and structured approach to be able to be well met. If you are not interested in the fact that the pollution and waste generation is threatening our existence, but you're rather interested only in the benefits, I can assure you that there are benefits. Let's see those benefits. So we can speak about the environment and health benefits, like reduced impact from waste and emissions, reduced demand for resources or resource efficiency, and so on. That's leading us to safer and cleaner environment. And secondly, let's look at the economic benefits. We can save on resources. We can reduce the cost of cleaning of the polluted environment or the treatment of waste. And there are no unnecessary legal costs anymore or fines for non-compliance. And we gain market access because businesses are more and more attractive if they ensure customers or investors that they are taking action for the protection of the environment. So in the framework of a circular economy, you have new business opportunities, but I will come back to this in more detail in my future slides. Let's look at the actors of the CEN-CENELEC in the environment. The CEN-VT Working Group 219 is the SABE, is the Strategic Advisory Body on Environment. Their role is to give strategic advice to the CEN-VT on the EU environmental policy developments and its impact on standardization. SABE is a platform of exchange on environmental topics and is open to all CEN national members, partners, stakeholders, and TCs. And their role is to identify future relevant and significant topics and also to promote the environmental standardization within the European Commission and across the CEN community. SABE works with 3 different teams. The first one is the environmental issues in standardization, the so-called INIS team. They are following up more strategic and horizontal issues, and they're providing advice to SABE. And the environmental monitoring strategy team, the ENV team. They are dealing with standardization needs in environmental measurements and monitoring. And last but not least, the environmental management team, the EMT team, dealing with environmental management and climate-related issues. You can find more information on the team's works and SABE works on our website. Now let's look at CENELEC. In CENELEC, the TC111X environment has a strategic and advisory role, kind of similar to the one of SABE at CEN, but they are at the same time a technical body with operational roles. And we also have the CEN standard bodies, NSBs, at CEN, and the national committees at the at CENELEC, and of course the stakeholders. Now let's speak a bit also about circular economy, because it has a big influence on standardization. It will change, the change is expected in the traditional structure of standardization. We will need closer cooperation among the sectors, for instance, better communication between the recycling and the production sector on the design and use of materials, for instance. We have to think about the industrial symbiosis when the waste of one sector will become the raw material of another one. And we also realize that the broader involvement or exchange with stakeholders like industry, SMEs, societal policymakers helps also identify the needs, the most recent needs. So in the future, we expect that we may have more project-based work taking account the needs of circularity. So industries may contribute to projects and the sector approach may disappear. So all in all, a further improvement of the cross-sectorial, more strategic coordination of circular economy-related standardization is necessary at CEN-CENELEC, and we started these discussions already. Now let's say a few words about the CEN environmental approach, which is basically based on a guidance document approved by the BT back in 2010. And this is a general framework to promote and ensure a better inclusion of environmental aspects into European standards. This is currently under revision. To be able to apply this, we provide some support. We have a centralized online toolbox. It's called Environmental Framework, where you can find CEN guides, CENELEC guides. I will elaborate this in my next slide. You can read about training possibilities. We have an excellent e-learning material. We have examples and best practices by sector. You can all find this on the website. And we also have a support provided by the CEN Environmental Help Desk. You can find more information on that on the hyperlink if you click later on. This is a service to promote and support the integration of environmental aspects in European standard. Is available for all CEN technical committees and obviously all interested parties. We constantly want to improve the support of the Environmental Help Desk, so your input is always welcome. At CEN, now let's speak a bit about the guides, the baseline, the so-called baseline guide, which we always refer to as the CEN Guide 4, which was adopted in 2018. Guide for addressing environmental issues in product standards is identical to ISO Guide 64, and it's based on a life cycle thinking. And it includes an environmental checklist to support the thinking process, which is a very practical approach. At CENELEC, we also have a similar guide, an IEC Guide 109, but this is not adopted at CENELEC level. It's similar to ISO Guide 64 and CEN Guide 4, and it's also based on a life cycle thinking, but it is only available on the IEC web store. Now let's go back to the rest of the guides we recently adopted. There are 3 new guides that were published, and they are complementing CEN Guide 4. One is the CEN-CENELEC Guide 32, addressing climate change adaptation in standards. You can find very useful checklists in the guide itself. We have the CEN-CENELEC Guide 33, addressing environmental issues in testing standards. That includes also a checklist, and you can download it also in a Word format from our website. And the CEN Guide 16, addressing chemicals in standards for consumer relevant products. You can find a link to related early webinars on the link below for the first 2 guides. And for the CEN Guide 16, we expect to have a new webinar before the end of this year. Now let's see about the environmental thinking, how to start it in technical bodies. So what we recommend that you start with the environmental clause in the thesis business plan. You can find it in the template itself. Obviously, you know that the thesis business plan is no longer mandatory, but you can always find then the necessary agenda point in the TC meeting agenda. And please don't delete it. Please don't ignore it. Rather, think about how can you address what could be issues that should be discussed in the upcoming TC meeting. And you can find also the environmental clause in the new work item proposal in projects. And nevertheless, consider the environment by revising the thesis title and scope. Here are some strategies or options of addressing environment in standards. So formulate the general approach in the business plan. I will come back to this in my next slide. So this can frame in the future, for the future, your work. You can develop an environmental standard as such that is related to the sector itself. You can use the environmental checklist. I will also come back to this in my next slide. So you can include the checklist as an annex in your standard, and I strongly recommend that depending on what you standardize, see also the checklist for services, test standards, and for adaptation to climate change. And of course, you can also incorporate specific environmental clause or clauses in your standard, one general environmental statement, and or statements throughout in the document depending on your needs. You can also transpose environmental requirements from EU directive or refer to other environmental standards. Now let's talk a bit about the circular economy, which is an issue that is extremely important to look at. Also when we are drafting the standards, we have to know that standards usually do not cover the whole life cycle, but in spite of that, it has to inspire our thinking. So what are the main principles we need to bear in mind? In a circular economy, the value of products and materials is maintained for as long as possible, which means that waste and resources use are minimized, material streams are efficiently managed and recycled, resources are kept within the economy when a product has reached the end of its life to be used again and again to create future value. And of course, it runs entirely on the basis of renewable energy. And it has no negative effects on human health or the ecosystem. Let's see some examples for business plans. This is an old business plan with an excellent example. You can see that the technical committee decided to look at emissions to the air, contamination of groundwater, efficient use of fuels, noise emissions, the recyclability of the products, and also intends to include the environmental checklist according to CEN Guide 4 as an annex. Let's see another business plan of the CEN-TC 339, sleep resistance of pedestrian surfaces. You can see that this technical committee intends to apply the precautionary principle, which is specified in CEN Guide 4. They want to address environmental human health protection and safety aspects. They want to prevent the pollution when drafting analytical test methods. They want to include processes, practices, techniques, materials, and products to avoid, reduce, or at least control the creation of emissions, discharges of any type of pollutants or waste. They want to avoid hazardous, toxic, or otherwise harmful substances and materials. They want to involve material reuse, recycling, and recovery at the end of life. And they also consider to invite environment experts to participate in the work. Now let's look at the life cycle thinking. First, at the product life cycle, I picked the bicycle because it's very easy to understand for everybody. So first you have to think about the stages of the life cycle. Here, these are the pre-production, production, use, maintenance, and end of life. So in the pre-production phase, you have to think about what could be the impacts on the environment, like natural resources extraction, natural resources transformation. Then you look at the production phase, you look at the manufacturing footprint of the product. You think about the materials you use, aluminum, carbon, titanium, stainless steel, rubber, plastics. What could be the impact of these? Are these precious metals that we need to use? Use of energy in the production processes that you can use always less. You can look at the packaging and transport aspects, so not to transport too far the raw material, from far the raw materials. You use the minimum packaging needed. And in the use phase, you have to think about the accessories a bike is needed, the energy that may be used, for instance, by electrical bikes, or when you're cleaning it, what could we get in the drainage system when you're washing your bikes. Then we move to the maintenance phase when you need to use lubricants, degreasers, how this will be disposed. You will use components, tires, brake pads, you also have to dispose that. And at the end of the life, you have to think about the recycling of the all materials you used, or you can also consider the reuse of the bike. Now let's see the life cycle, thinking of the testing life cycle. This is a simple life cycle, but when you look at of the cycle in the guide itself, you will see it's a bit more complex. I simplified it for the sake of this presentation. So it's sampling, sample preparation, testing, reuse, recycle, recover, dispose. And here in the little, on the side, you can see in the boxes some examples you can look at in the different stages. Like in the sampling stage, replace sampling by direct measurement, online monitoring, reduce the sample size, or in the case of sample preparation, think about the environmentally friendly storage and preservation methods, select low impact testing agents, minimize the emissions, minimize spillages, and during the testing itself, reduce the amount of testing agents, minimize here also spillages, reduce the test duration because maybe you may use less energy, reusable testing equipment should be applied if possible, and try to test multiple parameters in one single test. And at the last stage, at the reuse, recycling, recovery, disposal, think about separate waste, to separate the waste streams, to be able to recycle them, or recover samples or testing agents and equipment. And of course, avoid the release of substances with adverse effects on health or on the environment. Now, the next life cycle would be the service life cycle, which is also much more complex. In the guide itself, I simplified also for this presentation. So we have a service design as a stage, service promotion, service provision in end of service. Here you can also go around the cycle, think about what are the inputs like consumption of material resources, consumption of energy resources, or maybe land use, and think about the outputs, emissions to air, waste generation, discharges to water and land, noise, radiation, and so forth. So here's the environmental checklist for a product. You have to look at first at the column on the left where you see the environmental aspects. You can find the inputs, outputs. You have to identify this for your own activity, for your own product. What are the materials, water, energy, land, emissions to air, discharges to water, and so on. And you can see in the row the stages of the life cycle: acquisition, production, use, end of life, and something that applies to all stages like transportation. This is also up to you. You identify yourself which are the life cycle stages of your activity, and you can adapt accordingly to the checklist. So this is not carved in stone. When you already know that, for instance, you want to address land use in the use phase, then you can already indicate the section of the standard where you will address this. If you don't know yet, you only know that you will address at the later stage, for instance, energy. At the end of life, you just indicate yes, and you can always come back later and add the specific section once you addressed it. Or you can also tick no. If you check, then you already know that it was not relevant. This is just a description of the use of the checklist if you want to go through later. What is important here to highlight is that you have to keep in mind that the environmental burden should not be shifted from one life cycle stage to another. So some general recommendations on how to approach this. So very important that you start early in the development or the revision process of the standard. You collect data to identify product environmental aspects and impacts. You have to define the priorities, and following that, you have to use the life cycle approach, the circular thinking, as I explained earlier, and the tools I also listed earlier, like CEN Guide 4, Environmental Framework, Environmental Help Desk. You can do the e-learning course if you're not sure of yourself, and you can also involve external experts if you feel that you don't have sufficient expertise. And nevertheless, I encourage you to apply the principles at all stages of the life cycle that are specified in CEN Guide 4. Resource conservation, prevention of pollution, minimization of environmental risks and accidents, precautionary principle, and of course also the circular thinking. Some recommendations for the future. SABE is looking at these objectives to consider. Some are already addressed and some will be addressed in the future, like circular economy, climate change adaptation, sustainable development goals, and linked to standards, water stewardship, sustainable finance, environment aspects in digitalization, and biodiversity. We may have webinars on this in the future. I encourage you to read the CEN-CENELEC environmental brochure that was issued last year. And here, by clicking on the hyperlink, you can reach it and you can have a look. In this brochure, you can also read some testimonies from industry. For instance, the Europe's gas industry does not consider environmental commitment as a constraint, but rather as an opportunity. And the same applies to the construction works technical committee as well. But you can also watch success stories on greening the standards by clicking on the hyperlink just at the bottom of my slide. And these are uploaded to our websites. So your contribution to the standardization in the environment is that you should consider that your standard might have a negative impact on the environment. But this impact depends also on the choices you make. Those choices that you make at the design stage when picking materials, the chemicals used, and so on. So you can change, you can influence these impacts by careful planning and starting at a very early stage. So here are the key learning points of today. Please remember the benefits of considering environment in standards. Understand and apply the life cycle and circular thinking when you work. Start planning everything at an early stage, collect data and information. Use the tools, the environmental help desk support, the guides, and enroll for environmental training or do the e-learning.